On the morning of July 14, 1918, the streets of Paris erupted in celebration as the French capital marked Bastille Day with unprecedented fervor. Along the Champs-Élysées, beneath a cloudless summer sky, thousands of Parisians lined the broad avenue to witness the victory parade. Among the marching columns of Allied forces, a regiment of black American soldiers from the 369th Infantry strode with perfect precision, their uniforms crisp despite months of combat, their French Croix de Guerre medals gleaming in the sunlight. These men believed they were marching home to recognition and respect, earned through blood and valor on European battlefields. They could not have imagined how profoundly wrong that assumption would prove, nor how the contrast between their treatment in France and their reception in America would transform not just individual lives, but spark a movement that would reshape a nation. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these soldiers discovered in France would become a revelation so powerful that thousands would refuse to return home, and those who did would carry back a dangerous new consciousness that their own country feared more than any foreign adversary. James Reese Europe, a 40-year-old lieutenant and celebrated band leader from Mobile, Alabama, stood at attention as French General Henri Gouraud personally pinned the Croix de Guerre to his chest in February 1918. The ceremony took place in a village square near Château-Thierry, where Europe's unit had just spent 191 consecutive days in combat without relief, longer than any American unit in the conflict. As Gouraud embraced him in the traditional French manner, kissing both cheeks, Europe felt something crack inside him, some internal wall he had spent 4 decades constructing. Back home in Alabama, no white officer would have shaken his hand. Here, a French general embraced him as an equal warrior. The general spoke in French, which a translator converted to English, saying that Lieutenant Europe had demonstrated courage and leadership that honored both his uniform and his nation. The general asked to hear Europe's band play that evening, expressing genuine interest in the music he had heard about from other French officers. Europe returned to his quarters that afternoon and sat on his bunk for an hour, unable to process what had occurred. His hands trembled slightly as he held the medal. Other men in his unit noticed his demeanor and gave him space, understanding that something significant had shifted inside their commander. The 369th Infantry Regiment had arrived in France on New Year's Day 1918, aboard overcrowded transport ships, assigned to the worst quarters below deck, despite their status as United States soldiers. The voyage lasted 16 days through rough winter Atlantic waters. Men became ill from poor ventilation and inadequate food. White officers aboard the same vessel ate in proper dining rooms, while black enlisted men received rations in cramped holds. Private Marcus Johnson from Charleston kept a diary during that voyage. He wrote about the conversations among the men, their hopes and fears, their expectations that combat performance would finally earn them respect in America. Johnson described how older soldiers, veterans of the Spanish-American conflict 2 decades earlier, tried to manage expectations, warning younger men that heroism often went unrecognized when performed by black soldiers. The younger men dismissed these warnings as pessimism from a different generation. Johnson would later remember those conversations with bitter clarity. The American command immediately transferred the regiment to French control upon arrival, unable to reconcile the presence of armed black soldiers with their own segregationist policies. The official explanation spoke of operational necessity and Allied cooperation, noting that French forces needed reinforcements and that integrating black American troops into white American units would create administrative complications. The unspoken truth was simpler. American commanders refused to lead black troops into combat alongside white units. They feared that seeing black soldiers perform courageously would undermine racial hierarchies at home. They worried that black soldiers armed and trained for combat might resist segregation more effectively. They believed that keeping black troops separate would maintain proper social order. French commanders received these transferred soldiers with bewilderment at American attitudes and desperate gratitude for reinforcements. France had been bleeding for 3.5 years, losing an entire generation to the trenches and battlefields. French villages contained almost no men between the ages of 18 and 40. French military hospitals overflowed with wounded. French cemeteries expanded daily. French factories struggled to maintain production with depleted workforces. They needed every rifle they could get and cared nothing for the color of the hands holding them. General Henri Gouraud, commander of the French Fourth Army, received the Black American Regiment personally. He inspected their equipment, spoke with their officers, and issued orders that they be treated identically to French troops. Same rations, same quarters, same respect. When American liaison officers objected that this approach would create problems, Gouraud reportedly replied that his only problem was defeating the enemy, and these soldiers would help him do that. French troops reacted to their new Black American comrades with curiosity and acceptance. French soldiers asked questions about America, about jazz music they had heard about life in a country they imagined as wealthy and modern. When Black American soldiers described segregation, French troops initially thought they were joking or exaggerating. The concept seemed incomprehensible to men fighting for their nation's survival. Why would America cripple itself by refusing to fully utilize all its citizens? Corporal Antoine Moreau from Bordeaux shared rations with Private Thomas Washington from Atlanta during their first joint operation. Through a combination of broken English and hand gestures, Washington explained how he could not eat in white restaurants in Georgia, could not vote despite being a citizen, could not defend himself against violence from white residents. Moreau listened with growing confusion, then anger. He shared this conversation with other French soldiers who spread the information throughout the regiment. Within weeks, French troops had developed protective attitudes toward their Black American comrades, viewing them as men doubly oppressed, first by the conflict, then by their own country. Private Henry Johnson from Albany, New York, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. On the night of May 15, 1918, while on sentry duty in the Argonne Forest with Private Needham Roberts, they faced an assault by at least 20 German soldiers attempting to breach French lines. Johnson's rifle jammed after 3 shots. What happened next would become legend among French troops, but remained largely unknown in America for decades. With his rifle useless, Johnson drew his bolo knife, a curved blade issued for trench combat. In the darkness, illuminated only by occasional flares, he fought hand-to-hand against multiple opponents. Roberts had been wounded early in the engagement, but continued fighting from his position. Johnson moved between Roberts and the advancing Germans, using the knife with devastating effectiveness, sustaining 21 wounds while preventing the Germans from breaking through or capturing Roberts. French reinforcements arrived within minutes, attracted by the gunfire and shouting. They found Johnson still standing, bleeding from multiple wounds, surrounded by German casualties, protecting Roberts, who had been wounded but remained conscious. The French lieutenant who arrived first embraced Johnson immediately, kissing both cheeks despite the blood, calling him a hero in rapid French that Johnson could not understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. The French command awarded him the Croix de Guerre with star, making him the first American of any color to receive France's highest military honor for valor. French newspapers called him the Black Death, not as an insult, but as recognition of his effectiveness in combat. In French towns where his unit rested, children asked for his autograph. Women brought him flowers and baked goods. Men bought him drinks and wanted to hear his story repeatedly. French officers studied his action as an example of hand-to-hand combat technique and individual courage under impossible circumstances. The American command issued a brief communiqué acknowledging Johnson's medal but provided minimal details. American newspapers largely ignored the story. When Johnson's own mother sent him a letter from Albany, describing how she had been forced to move to the back of a streetcar while carrying his medal citation from French officials, he read it 3 times in his bunk that night, unable to reconcile the two realities. His hands shook as he held the letter. His bunkmate, Corporal William Harris from Philadelphia, found him crying silently and sat beside him without speaking, understanding that no words would address the profound injustice Johnson was processing. Corporal Horace Pippin from Westchester, Pennsylvania, kept a detailed diary throughout his service, writing by candlelight in the trenches after long days of combat operations. His entries from spring and summer 1918 reveal a man undergoing profound psychological transformation. In March, he wrote about receiving mail from home describing recent events in Tennessee and Georgia. His sister had written about families moving north to escape violence, about men being taken from their homes, about the constant atmosphere of fear in black communities. In April, Pippin described his first invitation to dinner at a French farmhouse. The family had lost their son in the conflict's second year. The father, too old for military service, maintained the farm with his wife and daughters. They invited Pippin and 3 other soldiers to dinner, seating them at their table, serving them home-cooked food on china dishes, treating them as honored guests. The eldest daughter, who spoke some English learned in school, asked Pippin about his family, his work before the conflict, his hopes for after the conflict ended. She listened to his responses with genuine interest, responding thoughtfully, treating him as an intellectual and social equal. Pippin wrote that evening, "Tonight I ate at a white family's table as their guest. The daughter spoke to me as she would any man. The father shook my hand and thanked me for defending France. I cannot describe what I feel. This is what normal should be. This is how people should treat each other. I am 29 years old, and this is the first time white people have treated me like a regular human being worthy of basic courtesy." In May, Pippin wrote about French soldiers asking his opinion on tactics during a planning session. A French captain spread maps on a table and invited input from all the soldiers present, including the black Americans. Pippin suggested a flanking approach based on terrain features he had observed during patrol. The captain listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, then incorporated Pippin's suggestion into the operational plan. When the operation succeeded, the captain publicly credited Pippin's tactical insight. Pippin wrote one sentence in capital letters and underlined it twice. "They see me as a man and a soldier, nothing less." By June, Pippin's entries revealed internal conflict. He wrote about the approaching end of the conflict and his dread of returning home. He described conversations with other soldiers who expressed the same fear, that they would be expected to forget what they had experienced, to accept again the limitations and humiliations of life in America as if nothing had changed. Pippin wrote that the conflict had changed everything, that he could never again accept being treated as less than fully human, that France had shown him a different possibility, and he could not unsee it. The French government issued explicit orders to all military and civilian personnel regarding the treatment of black American troops. These directives, preserved in military archives, instructed French citizens to treat black American soldiers with the same respect and courtesy afforded to all Allied soldiers. The orders specifically noted that these men were fighting and dying for French liberty and democracy and should be received as honored guests of France who had crossed an ocean to defend people they had never met. The orders went further, instructing that black American soldiers should be invited into French homes, welcomed in French businesses, and treated with the dignity befitting soldiers of any nation. Local officials were directed to organize welcoming ceremonies when black American units arrived in their areas and to ensure that local establishments served these soldiers without discrimination or hesitation. American Command responded by issuing their own secret directive to French liaison officers. A document titled "Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops." This memo explicitly requested that French military and civilian personnel avoid socializing with black soldiers, warned against treating them as equals, and expressed concern that equality in France would make black soldiers unfit to return to their proper place in American society. The document argued that French customs of treating all men equally contradicted American social organization and would create serious problems when these soldiers returned home expecting similar treatment. The memo suggested that excessive fraternization between French women and black American soldiers was particularly problematic, as it would give these soldiers ideas above their station. It noted that in America, black men who associated with white women faced severe social and legal consequences, and that preventing such associations in France would ease these soldiers' reintegration into American society. French officers largely ignored these requests. Some forwarded them to Paris with notes expressing disgust at American racial attitudes. One French colonel wrote in his report that America apparently feared its own soldiers more than it feared the enemy. and that such fear suggested deep problems in American society that France should not enable or support. He recommended that France continue treating all Allied soldiers with equal respect, regardless of American sensibilities about racial matters. French civilians, upon learning about American requests, reacted with incomprehension and anger. Many French families deliberately increased their hospitality toward Black American soldiers, inviting them to Sunday dinners, including them in family celebrations, and treating them with extra warmth as a form of protest against American racial attitudes. French business owners posted signs welcoming Allied soldiers of all backgrounds. French officials gave speeches praising Black American courage and explicitly rejecting racial discrimination. Sergeant William Butler from Anniston, Alabama, wrote to his sister in June 1918, describing an incident that captured the absurdity of his situation. His unit had fought for 3 days straight to secure a strategic position near Belleau Wood, engaging in intense combat that resulted in 30% casualties. After the position was secured, white American officers arrived with photographers and reporters. They ordered Butler's exhausted unit to the rear so that white troops could be photographed at the location for newspapers back home. The official explanation cited operational security and the need to rotate tired troops. The actual reasoning was transparently clear. American newspapers would not print photographs showing black soldiers in heroic combat situations. Such images would contradict prevailing narratives about black military capacity and potentially inspire undesired expectations among black Americans at home. A French captain named Laurent Dubois witnessed this exchange and erupted in rage. He confronted the American officers in rapid French, his voice rising steadily as he pointed at Butler's decimated unit, then at the fresh white troops being positioned for photographs. He gestured at the battlefield, at the casualties being carried away, at the blood-soaked ground that Butler's men had taken at such terrible cost. When Butler asked a French translator what Captain Dubois had said, the translator hesitated, then replied that the captain had used every profane term in the French language to describe the American officers. The captain had said that black troops had shed more blood for France in those 3 days than most French units shed in 3 months. He had said that they deserved recognition for their valor and sacrifice. He had called American racism more dangerous than enemy artillery because it destroyed men from within, poisoning their spirits even as they demonstrated extraordinary courage. The captain had concluded by saying that if America did not want to honor its black soldiers, France certainly would, and that he was filing an official report recommending every man in Butler's unit for French military honors. He made good on that promise. Over the following weeks, virtually every member of Butler's unit received French recognition for their actions near Belleau Wood. Butler wrote to his sister, "A French captain I barely know fought harder for my recognition than any American officer ever has. He was willing to damage his career standing up for us. I believe he meant every word. I think he genuinely sees us as soldiers and men, not as colored soldiers who need special treatment or lower expectations. That changes something inside you, knowing that someone sees you that clearly." The city of Lyon, France's third largest city, formally adopted the 369th Infantry Regiment, declaring the soldiers honorary citizens and inviting them for elaborate celebrations whenever they had leave. City officials organized parades, concerts, and ceremonies specifically to honor these black American soldiers. The city opened its finest restaurants, hotels, and entertainment venues to them without restriction or hesitation. In Lyon's cafes and restaurants, black soldiers ate at white-clothed tables, served by waiters who addressed them as Monsieur and Sir, with exactly the same deference shown to French military officers or wealthy civilians. They walked arm in arm with French women down public streets in broad daylight, without fear, harassment, or negative consequences. They attended theater performances and opera productions, sitting in whatever seats they could afford, not relegated to segregated balconies or refused entry entirely. They shopped in stores where clerks treated their money as equal to anyone else's and wrapped their purchases with the same care. Private Leon Hayward from Memphis wrote to his brother describing his first experience in a Lyon restaurant. He had approached the establishment with his unit, then waited outside for 20 minutes while his comrades entered, assuming he needed to use a back entrance or that the restaurant would refuse to serve him. A French family emerged from the restaurant and noticed him standing in the cold January evening, confused by his refusal to enter. Through gestures and broken English, they asked why he stood outside. When Haywood explained his expectation of being turned away or directed to a separate entrance, the family looked bewildered. The father, a factory manager named Bernard Fontaine, looked genuinely distressed. He insisted that Haywood enter immediately, personally escorted him inside, and insisted he join the Fontaine family at their table despite Haywood's protests. Fontaine spent 2 hours asking questions about Haywood's experiences in America, growing increasingly angry and disbelieving as he understood the reality of segregation. He asked how America could call itself the land of liberty while denying basic rights to so many citizens. He asked how white Americans could claim superiority while behaving with such obvious moral inferiority. He asked how American democracy could function when it excluded so many from participation. When the check came, Fontaine refused to let Haywood contribute. He embraced Haywood warmly, kissed both cheeks in the French manner, and said that any man willing to cross an ocean to defend France would never pay for a meal in his presence. He wrote his address on a card and insisted that Haywood visit his home the following week for Sunday dinner with his family. Haywood wrote to his brother, "I am 23 years old, and this is the first time in my life a white man has embraced me like a brother. The first time a white man has invited me into his home as an honored guest rather than as someone hired to work. I cannot describe what this feels like. I always thought white people just naturally saw us as less than them, that it was some universal truth. But these French people do not see color the way Americans do. They see soldiers, they see men, they see human beings. If they can do this, then American attitudes are a choice, not nature. That realization changes everything." The transformation was not universal or without complications. Some black soldiers struggled with the sudden freedom, unsure how to navigate a society that did not constantly remind them of their supposedly inferior status. Men who had spent their entire lives carefully managing their behavior around white people, avoiding eye contact, speaking deferentially, accepting humiliation as normal, found themselves in a society where such behaviors were unnecessary and even inappropriate. Corporal David Richardson from Mississippi wrote about this psychological difficulty. He described entering a Paris shop and automatically moving aside when a white woman entered, expecting to be ordered out of her way. The woman smiled at him, gestured for him to continue his transaction, and waited patiently. The shopkeeper treated both customers identically. Richardson found himself shaking after leaving the shop, overwhelmed by the simple experience of being treated as an ordinary customer. He wrote, "I realized I have been crippled by racism in ways I did not even understand. I have been trained to diminish myself, to occupy less space, to accept humiliation as normal. Here I do not need to do those things, but I keep doing them anyway out of habit. It will take time to unlearn decades of training in accepting less than full humanity. The French treat me normally, but I do not yet know how to be normal around white people. That is what racism has done to me." Other black soldiers faced hostility from white American soldiers who resented seeing black troops treated with respect. In Paris, bars and cafes, fights erupted when white American soldiers objected to seeing black soldiers socializing with French women, drinking at the same establishments, or wearing French military decorations. White American soldiers argued that the French were spoiling these men, giving them ideas that would make them dangerous when they returned home, undermining proper social order. French police consistently sided with the black soldiers in these confrontations, arresting white American troops for disturbing the peace, assault, and disorderly conduct. French magistrates imposed fines and brief jail sentences on white American soldiers who caused problems. American military police complained about French interference, arguing that matters between American soldiers should be handled by American authorities. French officials politely declined, noting that French law applied to all persons on French soil and that the French government would not tolerate racial violence in French cities, regardless of the nationality of the perpetrators. This protection by French authorities further reinforced to black soldiers that France operated under different principles than America. The very authorities who in America would have arrested black soldiers for defending themselves against white violence, here arrested white soldiers for initiating that violence. The law actually protected black soldiers. Legal authorities actually enforced justice regardless of race. This reality seemed almost fantastical to men raised under very different legal systems. The American military police began restricting leave for black soldiers, citing various pretexts about operational needs, security concerns, and administrative requirements. The real motivation was transparent: limiting black soldiers' exposure to French society and French attitudes. American commanders understood that every day these soldiers spent in France being treated as equals was a day that made them more psychologically difficult to return to segregation. French officials protested these restrictions loudly and repeatedly. They argued that soldiers who had fought with such distinction and suffered such casualties deserved liberty to enjoy the cities they had helped liberate. They pointed out that white American soldiers faced no such restrictions. They noted that black American soldiers had earned the right to rest and recreation just as surely as any Allied troops. They threatened to file formal diplomatic complaints about discriminatory treatment of soldiers on French soil. American commanders responded by citing military necessity and operational requirements. They argued that different units had different readiness standards and that black units needed more intensive training and supervision. French officials stopped accepting these explanations and began simply ignoring American restrictions, providing passes and transportation to black soldiers who requested leave, effectively overriding American military authority. Lieutenant James Reese Europe's band became a cultural phenomenon in France that transcended military entertainment. Their performances introduced French audiences to jazz, a music born from the very oppression these soldiers had escaped by crossing the Atlantic. In Paris concert halls, Lion theatres, Marseille clubs, and countless smaller venues, Europe's band played to sold-out crowds who had never heard anything like the syncopated rhythms and improvised melodies emerging from these American instruments. French musicians crowded backstage after performances, asking detailed questions about technique, harmony, rhythm, and improvisation. They wanted to understand how this music worked, how it was constructed, how it could be learned and adapted. Europe patiently explained the African and African-American roots of jazz, the role of improvisation, the importance of rhythm and syncopation, the way jazz musicians communicated through their instruments. French composers attended multiple concerts, bringing notebooks, transcribing what they heard, recognizing they were witnessing something revolutionary. Claude Debussy, elderly and ill with the cancer that would end his life later that year, attended one performance in Paris. He reportedly told a colleague afterward that American black soldiers had brought France a gift more valuable than military victory. They had brought a genuinely new art form, something that had never existed before, a music that would change how the world understood sound and rhythm and melody. Europe and his musicians recognized the profound irony of their situation. In America, they had been relegated to playing for black audiences in segregated venues, their artistry unrecognized by white critics who dismissed jazz as primitive noise unworthy of serious attention. They had been barred from recording opportunities given to lesser white musicians. They had been excluded from major concert halls and prestigious venues. Their innovations had been stolen by white musicians who received credit and payment for black creativity. In France, they performed for integrated audiences that included military officers, government officials, cultural leaders, and ordinary citizens who treated them as serious artists worthy of study, respect, and substantial payment. French critics wrote lengthy reviews analyzing their performances, comparing them favorably to classical traditions, discussing their artistic merit in ways that American critics refused to do. French recording companies offered contracts. French promoters organized tours. French audiences demanded encores and return performances. After one Paris concert at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, a prestigious venue usually reserved for classical music and opera, a French music critic named Maurice Leclerc approached Europe backstage. Through a translator, Leclerc explained that he had reviewed music for 30 years and had never heard anything comparable to what Europe's band had performed. He said jazz represented a fundamental innovation in Western music, that it would influence composition for generations, that Europe should be recognized as a major musical figure of his era. Then Leclerc asked if Europe planned to return to America after the conflict ended. Europe paused for a long moment before answering. He said he had given his word to return, that he had responsibilities and commitments in America. But the question troubled him deeply, keeping him awake that night in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, imagining what life might be like if he stayed in France, imagining continuing to perform for audiences who valued his artistry, imagining never again being turned away from a restaurant or hotel because of his skin color, imagining raising children in a country that would treat them as simply French rather than as colored Americans. But he had a wife in America. He had a musical career built over 2 decades. He had communities that depended on him. He had promises to keep. He wrote to his wife that night, describing the evening's performance and the critics' words, but he did not mention his temptation to stay in France. Some thoughts were too dangerous to commit to paper. Private William Colson from Savannah wrote to his wife Maybelle in August 1918, describing a conversation that had shaken him profoundly. His unit had been billeted in a barn on a farm near Reims. The farmer, a man named Philippe Rousseau, whose sons had both been lost in the conflict's 2nd year, approached Colson one evening as he cleaned his equipment. Through a translator who served with the French liaison unit, Rousseau asked Colson about his life in America. What work did he do? How was his family? What were his hopes after the conflict ended? The questions seemed innocent, motivated by genuine curiosity and the universal desire of people to understand those who had traveled great distances to help them. Colson, relaxing after a successful operation, answered honestly. He described his work as a carpenter in Savannah. He described his wife and their 2 children. He described the segregation laws that governed every aspect of their lives. He explained how he could not vote despite being a citizen. He described how he could be arrested for using white facilities or entering white neighborhoods. He explained about segregated schools, churches, restaurants, and transportation. He described the constant threat of violence from white residents and the knowledge that legal authorities would not protect him or punish his attackers. The translator kept stopping, asking Colson to repeat himself, seemingly unable to believe what he was hearing. Rousseau's expression moved from curiosity to confusion to growing horror. Finally, through the translator, Rousseau asked directly if Colson was exaggerating. If conditions could truly be so terrible for soldiers fighting for American democracy. Colson removed his helmet and showed Rousseau a scar on his scalp from where he had been struck by a white shopkeeper in Savannah 2 years earlier. The offense had been entering through the front door instead of the rear entrance designated for black customers. No charges had been filed against the shopkeeper. When Colson reported the attack to police, they had threatened to arrest him for causing trouble. Rousseau wept openly, embracing Colson and speaking rapidly in French. The translator explained that Rousseau was apologizing on behalf of all white people for such treatment, saying he was ashamed that anyone could be so cruel to a fellow human being, especially to a soldier fighting for liberty. Rousseau insisted that Colson move immediately from the barn into the farmhouse, into a real bed in the room that had belonged to his younger son. His wife prepared a feast despite wartime shortages, seating Colson at the head of their table, serving him first, treating him as an honored guest and surrogate son. Colson wrote to his wife Maybelle, "These white French people treat me better than any white person in Georgia ever has. They weep at hearing about my life. They feel shame at what white Americans do to us. They cannot understand how a country claiming to fight for democracy denies democracy to so many of its own people. Maybelle, I do not know how I will bear returning home after knowing such treatment is possible. I have lived for 4 months as a full human being. How do I go back to being less?" Sergeant Noble Cecil from Indianapolis kept detailed records of his unit's reception in French villages throughout spring and summer 1918. In each location, local officials organized formal ceremonies welcoming Black American troops. These were not perfunctory events, but elaborate celebrations reflecting genuine gratitude and respect. Children presented flowers. Local bands played both the American and French national anthems. Mayors gave speeches, thanking the Americans for coming to France's aid and specifically praising the courage and sacrifice of black soldiers. In one village near the Belgian border, a place called Aubenton that had been nearly destroyed by earlier combat, the mayor organized a ceremony, despite the damaged town hall and depleted population. The mayor himself was an elderly man who had served in the Franco-Prussian conflict 50 years earlier. He walked with a cane from old wounds, but he stood straight during the ceremony. Through a translator, the mayor told assembled Black American troops that he judged soldiers not by their skin color, but by their willingness to stand in trenches and face enemy fire. He said Black American soldiers had demonstrated courage equal to any troops France had ever seen. He said France would remember their sacrifice long after politicians in America had forgotten. He said that these men were forever citizens of France in spirit, that they would always be welcome in French homes and French communities, that France owed them a debt that could never be fully repaid. The mayor concluded by presenting the unit's commander with keys to the town, a symbolic gesture indicating that Black American soldiers had complete freedom of the community, that they were trusted and respected residents, not temporary visitors. He invited them to return after the conflict as guests of the town, promising that Aubenton would host them annually if they wished to visit France in peacetime. Cecil wrote that several men in his unit cried during that speech, not from sadness but from the overwhelming experience of being recognized, truly seen as full human beings and valued soldiers for the first time in their lives. He described how the ceremony transformed these hardened combat veterans into men who could barely maintain their composure. He noted that after the ceremony, multiple soldiers asked if he thought the mayor had meant his words, or if this was simply wartime propaganda. Cecil wrote that he believed the mayor meant every word, and that this sincerity made the experience even more powerful and painful, because it revealed what was possible and what these men would lose when they returned to America. The armistice came on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In Paris, celebrations lasted for 3 days. The streets became impassable with jubilant crowds. Bells rang continuously. People sang and danced. Strangers embraced. Years of fear and loss and grief gave way to joy and relief and hope. Black American soldiers found themselves swept up in crowds of jubilant French citizens, who hugged them, kissed them, lifted them on shoulders, and marched them through streets in impromptu parades. French women danced with them in public squares, initiating contact without hesitation or shame. French men toasted them in cafes, buying rounds for entire groups, refusing to accept payment or thanks. French children followed them like heroes, asking for their caps or buttons as souvenirs, wanting to touch these soldiers who had helped save France. Corporal Edgar Thompson from Birmingham wrote to his mother describing the armistice celebrations in Paris. He described being embraced by strangers, kissed by French women young and old, hoisted onto shoulders and carried through streets while crowds cheered. He described sitting in a cafe where French veterans from earlier conflicts toasted Black American soldiers and declared them brothers in arms. He described children asking for his autograph, treating him as someone important and admirable. Then, Thompson described walking down a street in Birmingham in his mind, imagining what would happen if he dared look a white woman in the eye, much less have one kiss his cheek in public. He imagined the violence that would follow, the arrest if he were lucky, worse if he were not. He wrote, "Mother, I do not think I can come back to that life. I have seen what is possible. I have been treated as a man worthy of respect. I have lived 4 months as a full human being. How do I go back to being treated as less? How do I accept again what I now know is not necessary or natural, but simply American cruelty?" The French government announced that Black American troops would be honored in all official victory celebrations, that they would march in parades, receive medals in public ceremonies, and be recognized alongside all Allied forces that had liberated France. The American command objected strenuously, arguing that such public recognition would create problems when these soldiers returned home. They requested that black troops be excluded from victory parades, or at least placed at the end of American formations where they would be less visible. French officials dismissed these objections with barely concealed contempt. A French general told American liaison officers that France honored courage and sacrifice regardless of the soldier's race, and that to exclude black soldiers from victory celebrations would dishonor France's own values and the very liberty for which the conflict had been fought. He said that black American soldiers had earned their place in victory parades through blood and valor, and that France would not participate in American racial policies. On the July 14, 1919, Bastille Day parade in Paris, the 369th Infantry marched at the front of the American delegation, immediately behind French forces. Over 100,000 Parisians lined the route, cheering specifically for the black Americans they recognized as among the bravest of Allied soldiers. Women threw flowers, veterans saluted, children waved French and American flags with equal enthusiasm. Lieutenant Europe led his band in playing the Marseillaise first, and the entire crowd sang along, many weeping openly at the symbolism of liberation and survival. Then the band transitioned seamlessly into jazz, and the parade became a spontaneous celebration of American black music, with Parisians attempting to dance along to rhythms they had never heard before the conflict, but had come to love through Europe's performances throughout the previous 18 months. Private James Miller from Atlanta stood in formation during that parade, tears streaming down his face, knowing that this moment, this recognition, this treatment as an equal and valued soldier would end the moment his ship docked in America. He wrote to his brother that night, "Today I marched as a man. Today I was honored as a soldier. Today I experienced what it feels like to be seen as fully human. Tomorrow begins the countdown to returning to being something less. I do not know if I can bear it. I do not know if I should even try." As victory celebrations continued throughout summer 1919, American commanders pressured black units to depart France immediately. The longer these soldiers remained in an environment where they experienced equality, the more dangerous American officers believed they would become to the racial order back home. Ships were requisitioned specifically for black units. Departure dates were moved forward without explanation. Leave was cancelled abruptly. Orders came with unusual urgency. Black soldiers recognized what was happening and resisted in ways small and large. Some missed ship departures, claiming illness or confusion about orders, submitting medical documentation from sympathetic French doctors. Others formally requested transfers to French units that remained on occupation duty in Germany or along French borders, citing their integration with French forces and their value as liaisons. A few simply disappeared into French cities, deserting but finding French authorities remarkably unhelpful when American military police came searching. French officials, recognizing what was occurring, quietly assisted these efforts. French families offered to hide soldiers in their homes if military police came asking questions. French employers offered jobs with documentation, backdated to suggest longer employment. French women married American black soldiers in ceremonies organized with unusual speed, providing legal grounds for remaining in France that American authorities could not easily challenge. The French government processed these marriages quickly and issued French residency permits without the usual bureaucratic delays that typically characterized French administration. By summer 1919, American command estimated that approximately 5,000 black soldiers had either formally remained in France through legal mechanisms or deserted to do so. The actual number was likely higher, as many soldiers simply melted into French society, particularly in larger cities like Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, where an American accent could be explained away, and skin color did not immediately mark someone as suspicious or unwelcome. The military conducted investigations, but with limited enthusiasm. Publicly pursuing thousands of deserters would require explaining why so many black soldiers preferred exile in a foreign country to returning to America, a question that would inevitably expose uncomfortable truths about American racial policies. The decision was made to quietly drop most cases, noting in confidential memoranda that pursuing these soldiers would create more problems than it would solve. Corporal Thomas Hall from New Orleans wrote to his sister Sarah explaining his decision to remain in France. The letter, preserved in family archives, provides a window into the calculations these men made. Hall had been offered a job in a Paris restaurant owned by a French veteran, not as kitchen help or cleaning staff, but as a manager responsible for operations and personnel. A French woman named Genevieve, whom he had been seeing for several months, asked him to meet her parents. They received him warmly, asked thoughtful questions about his background and intentions, and gave their blessing to the relationship after a 2-hour conversation conducted partly in French and partly in Hall's improving but still limited English. Hall had found an apartment in the 11th arrondissement, a working-class neighborhood of Paris, with a mix of French workers, immigrants from various countries, and a small but growing community of Black Americans who had remained after the conflict. No one in the building questioned his right to be there. No one demanded he use separate entrances or facilities. The concierge greeted him by name and occasionally brought him mail with the same courtesy she showed all residents. He attended concerts and theater performances, sat in cafes reading newspapers, walked through parks in the evening, lived an ordinary life that would have been completely impossible in New Orleans. He wrote, "I know you will miss me, Sarah, and I will miss you terribly. You have been the best sister a man could hope for. But sister, I cannot come back. I have tasted freedom. I have lived as a man rather than as a problem to be managed. I have been seen as more than the color of my skin. To return would be to destroy something inside me that has come alive here, something I did not even know was missing until I arrived in France. Please understand. Please forgive me. But I cannot come back to being less than human. Not now, not after this." The soldiers who did return home encountered exactly what they feared. In some southern ports, white mobs attacked black soldiers as they disembarked, tearing off their French medals, physically assaulting them while police watched without intervening. Black soldiers who wore their uniforms in public were threatened and sometimes attacked for acting uppity, for presuming that military service entitled them to respect. Those who spoke about their experiences in France, who described being treated as equals by white French people, were silenced through threats of violence if they did not stop spreading lies. In Valdosta, Georgia, a returning sergeant named William Little refused to remove his uniform when confronted by a group of white men who told him no black man would wear that uniform with dignity in their town. When Little protested that he had fought for America, that he had earned the right to wear his uniform with pride, one of the men responded by saying Little had fought for the wrong country if he thought that entitled him to respect from white people. Little was found 3 days later in a wooded area outside town, still wearing his French croix de guerre. Local authorities ruled his passing as suspicious but made no arrests. The summer and fall of 1919 saw more than 25 major racial conflicts across America, concentrated in areas with significant returning black veteran populations. In Chicago, in Omaha, in Washington, in Elaine, Arkansas, in dozens of smaller towns, violence erupted as white Americans attacked black communities and black veterans fought back with military training, combat experience, and a new understanding of their own worth and right to defend themselves. White newspapers blamed black soldiers who had been corrupted by French attitudes and who refused to accept their proper place in American society. They argued that France had spoiled these men, given them dangerous ideas and made them unfit for American life. They called for restrictions on black military service to prevent future corruption of racial attitudes. Black newspapers published first-hand accounts of how black soldiers had been treated in France, creating in black communities a hunger for that same recognition and respect. The stories from France circulated through churches, barbershops, lodge halls, and living rooms. They were read aloud at community meetings, discussed in detail, analyzed for their implications. The stories became powerful tools for activists arguing that American racial attitudes were not natural or inevitable, but choices that other civilized nations rejected. The Negro World, a newspaper with wide circulation in black communities, ran a series titled How France Treats Its Defenders that published letters from black soldiers describing their experiences. The Chicago Defender published photographs of black soldiers being honored by French officials, marching in French parades, receiving French medals from French generals. The Crisis magazine published essays by black intellectuals analyzing the contrast between French and American racial attitudes and arguing that the French example proved racial equality was achievable if white Americans chose to pursue it. James Europe returned to America and reformed his band, touring to enormous success among black audiences who packed theaters to hear the music that had conquered Paris. Europe's performances drew audiences who wanted to hear jazz, but also wanted to hear stories about France, about how black soldiers had been treated, about what life could be like in a society that did not organize itself entirely around racial hierarchy. Europe spoke between musical numbers, describing French audiences, French respect, French recognition of black artistry. These stories resonated deeply with audiences who had never experienced such treatment from white Americans. In May 1919, after a performance in Boston, Europe was stabbed during a dispute with one of his drummers, a man named Herbert Wright. The argument allegedly concerned Wright's behavior during performances, but some who knew both men suggested deeper tensions about the psychological pressures of returning to American racism after experiencing French equality. Europe died within hours from his injuries, becoming one of the first casualties of the psychological conflict that black veterans brought home with them. Europe's funeral in New York drew thousands of mourners, both black and white, who lined the streets of Harlem. French officials sent a representative who laid a wreath and read a statement from the French government honoring Europe's contributions to both military victory and cultural exchange. The statement noted that France would never forget Lieutenant Europe or the black American soldiers who had fought for French liberty, and that these men would always be welcome in France as honored brothers. The statement was published in full in the New York Times, one of the few times a major white American newspaper gave such prominent coverage to French recognition of black American contributions. The experience of black soldiers in France became a founding story for what would later be called the New Negro Movement, and eventually the Civil Rights Movement. The knowledge that respect and equality were possible, that other nations did not share America's racial obsessions, that white people in France could and did see black Americans as fully human, became a psychological weapon that could not be confiscated or suppressed. W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in the Crisis magazine throughout 1919 and 1920, published dozens of first-hand accounts from returning soldiers. He analyzed the French experience, arguing that it proved racial prejudice was a choice rather than a biological necessity. He wrote that black soldiers had seen behind the curtain of white supremacy and recognized it as artifice rather than natural law. He argued that this knowledge could never be erased, that it would fuel demands for change until America either granted equality or faced increasingly organized resistance. In French cities, the black Americans who had remained began building lives that would have been completely impossible at home. In Paris, a community emerged first around Montmartre and later Montparnasse, where American black musicians, artists, writers, and everyday working people found acceptance and opportunity. French fascination with jazz ensured steady work for musicians. French publishers proved willing to publish black writers whose work American publishers rejected. French art galleries exhibited work by black artists that American galleries would not display. Eugene Bullard from Columbus, Georgia, exemplified these expatriate success stories. Bullard had served as a pilot in the French Air Service during the conflict, one of only a handful of black combat pilots in the world. After the armistice, he remained in Paris, opening a nightclub called L'Escadrille, decorated with aviation memorabilia from his service. The club became a gathering place for the American black expatriate community and attracted French intellectuals, artists and political figures curious about American racial dynamics and eager to support black Americans who had chosen France over their homeland. Bullard married Marcelle Straumann, a French woman from a respectable family who saw no issue with marrying a black American. They had 2 daughters who attended French schools without encountering segregation, played with French children without racial conflict, and grew up understanding themselves as French citizens who happened to have an American father. Bullard lived in a fashionable neighborhood where neighbors greeted him cordially. He built a successful business that served both French and American customers. He participated in local civic life. He lived, in short, as a normal citizen. When visiting American journalists asked why he did not return home, Bullard responded simply that he had found home, that Paris had given him what America never could, the freedom to be fully human without constantly navigating racial restrictions. He said he felt no nostalgia for Georgia, where he would have been denied the most basic rights of citizenship. He said his daughters would never know the humiliation he had experienced growing up black in the South, and that alone justified his decision to remain in France. The contrast between Bullard's life in Paris and what awaited him in Georgia became a story told and retold in black communities across America, passed from person to person, published in black newspapers, discussed in churches and community centers. It served as concrete evidence of what was possible in a society that did not organize itself around racial hierarchy. It gave people hope and created expectations that would eventually fuel movements for change. By 1920, the American government had largely stopped trying to force black soldiers to return from France. The effort had become counterproductive, generating negative publicity in international press and strengthening arguments that America treated its black citizens worse than wartime adversaries. French officials made clear through diplomatic channels that they would not cooperate with forced repatriation, particularly of soldiers who had married French citizens or found legal employment. French newspapers published sympathetic stories about black American soldiers choosing France over their homeland, often with pointed commentary about American hypocrisy in preaching democracy, while denying it to substantial portions of its own population. The State Department quietly noted in internal memoranda that the presence of several thousand black American expatriates in France created ongoing problems for American racial policy and international reputation. These men served as living refutations of arguments that black Americans were naturally inferior or incapable of functioning successfully in civilized society. They demonstrated that black Americans could thrive when given equal opportunity. They provided inconvenient examples whenever American diplomats spoke about democracy and equality. The department recommended monitoring these expatriates, but acknowledged that little could be done to force their return without creating greater diplomatic embarrassments. In black newspapers across America, advertisements began appearing for French language courses, French cultural societies, and even French pen pal exchanges. Young black Americans, learning about how their soldiers had been treated in France, began dreaming of Paris and Lyon and Marseille as places where they might escape American racial restrictions. Some saved money specifically for travel to France. Others wrote letters to French pen pals asking about job opportunities, housing costs, and social attitudes. A few organized groups to support potential immigration to France. This dream of France as a refuge would shape black American culture for decades to come. The migration started as a trickle in the 1920s and grew steadily. Writers like Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, and James Baldwin would eventually make the journey, finding in Paris the freedom to write about their full humanity without needing to constantly navigate white American expectations or prejudices. Musicians like Sidney Bechet and Josephine Baker would find fame and acceptance in France that America denied them, building successful careers while living as ordinary citizens rather than as exotic curiosities. Artists and intellectuals would create in Paris what they could not create in New York or Chicago, work that addressed their complete humanity without compromise. The soldiers who remained in France wrote letters home describing their lives in detail. These letters circulated through black communities, read aloud in churches, discussed in living rooms, preserved in family archives. They described marriages to French women who did not see racial mixing as wrong or dangerous. They described children who attended integrated schools without incident, who played with French children without racial conflict, who grew up viewing themselves as simply French rather than as members of a subordinate caste. They described businesses that served them without question or hesitation. They described theaters that seated them without segregation. They described police who protected them rather than harassed them. They described courts that recognized their legal rights. They described, in short, lives of ordinary citizenship that would have been extraordinary miracles in America. Corporal Samuel Brooks from Birmingham wrote to his cousin Raymond in 1921, describing his life in Lyon with unusual specificity. He had married Marie Laurent, a French seamstress who operated a small shop. They had a daughter named Claudette, who was now 2 years old, and attended a local nursery where she played with French children of various backgrounds. He worked as a mechanic in a garage owned by a French veteran named Antoine Mercier, who treated him as a skilled craftsman, deserving of fair wages and respect, rather than as cheap labor to be exploited. He attended local cafes where other patrons greeted him by name and engaged him in conversations about politics, sports, and local news. He voted in local elections. He paid taxes. He filed complaints when he had grievances and received responses from authorities who addressed his concerns seriously. He lived, in every meaningful sense, as an ordinary citizen. He wrote, "I think about coming home to visit Raymond, but Marie says she would fear for my life there, for Claudette's life. She has read about America and cannot understand how a country that claims to represent liberty could deny liberty to so many of its own people. She asks me to explain segregation, and I try, but even I no longer understand it after living here. It seems insane from this distance, this obsession with controlling people based on skin color. This elaborate system designed to diminish and humiliate people for no reason other than prejudice. Living here has shown me that America's system is not natural or necessary, just a choice white Americans have made and continue to make. That knowledge changes everything, Raymond. I can never unsee what I now know is possible. The French experience created a generation of black Americans who could never fully accept the racial status quo because they had personally experienced its alternative. Those who returned carried that knowledge back, sharing it wherever they went, spreading it through communities, using it to challenge assumptions about racial hierarchy being natural or inevitable. Those who remained in France served as permanent evidence that black Americans could thrive when given equal opportunity. Both groups, those who returned and those who stayed, contributed to a growing consciousness that would eventually fuel the civil rights movement. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.